welcome to the gathering. My name's Jake, if I haven't met you yet. And this marks the first week of the Advent season. So happy holidays, Merry Christmas. For those of us like me who celebrate way too early, now's the time when we can appropriately say that we celebrate Christmas. So I'm glad to be here. You may have noticed we have more kids in the room than normal. So kids, welcome. We're glad you are here. And let me just say a word for all of the parents in the room. We are so glad that your kids can join us this morning. And as a dad of 4 kids, I'm just used to talking over kids crying. Like, that's just what I do. That's just my life. So if your kids start crying or getting fidgety, totally cool. We are glad that they are with us this morning. As was said, just now, we are celebrating the Advent season where we celebrate with the global historic church the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. And that word Advent means arrival, where we celebrate the arrival of Jesus 2,000 years ago with his incarnation. And we look forward to the day for his second advent, his second arrival, when he will come and fix all things that are broken. Now, if you want to get super technical here, if you look at the liturgical calendar, Advent technically starts next week across the global church, but we just love Jesus a lot, so we wanted to give him an extra week. And that might be our greatest weakness, is just we love Jesus too much. I don't know. That's just us. But this is a time where we slow down a little bit, and amidst the hustle of the Christmas season, when we're just going from one thing to the next, one party to the next, we're just racing to Christmas shop and get all the deals. This is a time when we, as the global church, just put a pause on all of that and remember why Advent is so special in the first place. So what I want us to do this morning is I want us to open up the Bible and look at why Jesus has come into the world. So if you have a Bible, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 through 23. Would invite you all to turn there. Matthew 1, 18 through 23. And starting in verse 18, it says, "This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about." So to give us some context, if you look at those passages right before Matthew chapter 18, we're given a whole genealogy, which I could just riff off on why genealogies are actually really cool and really fun. We don't have time to get into that. You're just going to have to trust me on that one. All that to say, when we get to verse 18, Matthew says, all right, now with all of that in mind, let me tell you about the story of how God came into the world and took on flesh. Verse 18, his mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. So pause right there. Let's just acknowledge that is a super weird thing, all right? To be pregnant with the Holy Spirit. I don't know if you took your biology class. That's not how pregnancy works, okay? And back then, they knew that too, all right? That's why verse 19, because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. In other words, he also knows how biology works. And when Mary, his fiance, is like, hey, I'm pregnant with the Holy Spirit, Joseph is like, okay, yeah, sure you are. Anyway, verse 20, after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Now, you might miss that for a second, but what's the significance? Call his name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Why is that any significance at all? It's like my son the other day, I was praying for him, and he asked me, Dad, why is his name Jesus? And I was like, well, that's what his parents named him. But he was like, no, but why Jesus though? Why not Bob or Steve? I was like, well, first of all, Bob Christ does not roll off the tongue as easily. But the name Jesus is a transliteration of the Hebrew name Yeshua, or where we get the name Joshua, and that literally means salvation. So when they say Jesus, that's evoking that idea of salvation. He will save his people from their sins. Verse 22, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So what I want to do, I want to hone in on that last verse, verse 23. Matthew cites the book of Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 7:14. This was written about 700 years before the birth of Jesus. And the thing you got to know, when you read the book of Matthew, he's coming from a very Jewish mindset. He's writing to a mostly Jewish audience, all to show how the Old Testament is all pointing to Jesus. And not just in the quick prophecies, but how even Jesus' birth is embodying the entire story of the Old Testament. So when he drops a line like Isaiah 7, he wants the reader's minds to connect back to the stories surrounding Isaiah 7. So here's a quick story. Here's a quick flyby of what's going on with Isaiah. So 700 years before the birth of Jesus, there's a king of Judah named Ahaz. And at that point, it's a time of war, it's a time of violence, and it's a time of bloodshed. So just in case you thought the first Christmas story was going to give you the warm fuzzies like Jimmy Stewart in A Wonderful Life, this has a lot more violence and chaos going on. It's more like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, because that is a Christmas movie. So King Ahaz sees that Assyria is conquering near every other nation and empire around him. He's worried Assyria is going to come and destroy his kingdom, which if you're him, that makes a lot of sense why you would think that. You're a young ruler, and death and destruction are at your doorstep. The Assyrian army is huge, and your army is much, much smaller. And I know, I didn't go to military school, but I just know if you're at war, you want your army to be bigger than the other guy. But it's the opposite. Assyria is coming, and their army is much larger than yours. Way less. So he's panicking. Rightfully so. He's like, what do I do? Should I just surrender right away? Should I join forces with other nations around me? Should we team up to fight against Assyria? Do we battle them on our own? Do we try to make a truce with them? God, what do we do? What are we going to do? God, where are you? We don't know. So Ahaz asks the prophet Isaiah, hey, what do we do? What are we doing now? When life is hanging in the balance and the enemies are at the gates, how do we know God will protect us? How do we know God will fight for us? Where is God in the midst of what's going on all around us? And King Ahaz is just looking for some shred of hope in all of this, to which Isaiah says back to the king in Isaiah 7:13. Isaiah says, hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Isaiah responds back to Ahaz freaking out, and he's being a little snippy and a little sarcastic, which is my love language. I like that. And Isaiah's kind of like, man, what are you even talking about? You're the king. Do you even know your history at all? Yeah, your army is way less, but look at your history. God has a tendency to use the weaker to overcome the stronger. If you look back at Moses in the wilderness, their army was way less, and God was with them and fought on behalf of them and conquered the other armies around them. When you look back at Joshua in the promised land, their army was always so much smaller, and yet God fought for them and was on their side. When you look, Ahaz, at your great-great-great-grandpa, King David, it was the same thing. His army was so small, and yet God fought for him and was on his side. Trust in that. But even with all of that, Isaiah still offers him a sign. He says, you want a sign? You want something you can hope in? Here's this, verse 14. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. The child born to a virgin will be the sign that God will deliver on his promises, that Ahaz and the people of Judah can and should have trust him at his word, despite how the odds are stacked against them, to trust that God is with them and for them. And this child would be God himself with the people. It's like Isaiah is saying, you need something to hope in. I'll tell you who to hope in, Emmanuel. God with us. But this is where I want to focus our attention on today. Emmanuel is a name, or perhaps more accurately, a title that gets thrown around a lot. It's pretty common at Christmas time to sing songs that have the lyric or the title of Emmanuel. And it's very easy for you to just hear that, absorb that, and it just feels so much like white noise that we kind of miss the impact, the oomph of what that title has. I mean, back when, Christian radio in the 80s and 90s, we got not one, but two power ballads by the name of Emmanuel. And I listened to it earlier this week, and I can tell you, like, I felt so old listening to those songs by Michael W. Smith and Amy Grant again called Emmanuel. It's like, as soon as that synth dropped, I was like, I feel ancient now. Like, oh my goodness. In case you were wondering, do those ballads hold up? No, they don't. The context clues, 80s, 90s Christian power ballads, of course they don't hold up. But that was most of the genre of music back then. This isn't on here, I'm just riffing now. But there was a one song back in the 80s, 90s Christian power ballad. I don't know if any of y'all would recognize this, Carol of the Bells, but it wasn't to choir or instruments. It was to the sounds of animals singing. Does anyone remember that at all? All right, few people are nodding with me. It was just animals singing together the Carol of the Bells. And then at the end of that song, you hear a baby crying. And you realize that's baby Jesus. And all those animals were all the animals in the manger singing together Carol of the Bells. And that's when I became a Christian. But all that to say, if we're not careful, we actually miss out on the cosmic significance of what Emmanuel is all about. Emmanuel means God with us. And I think it's one of the most powerful, most beautiful things about this season. God became incarnate to be with us. And I believe your whole life hinges on what you make out of the name Emmanuel. The ability to endure hardship and to handle stress when the proverbial enemies are at the gates and all seems lost and the odds seem stacked up against you, when all feels hopeless and you're wondering like Ahaz, God, where are you? All hinges on what you believe about the name Emmanuel. And here's the thing, this promised child in Isaiah 7 did not come right away. In fact, if you continue reading in Isaiah, Ahaz doesn't end up trusting God or his word. And because of his distrust, he leads his people eventually into being captured and exiled into Assyria and Babylon. So fast forward now to the book of Matthew, 700 years, and the Jewish people, many have returned to their homeland, but now there's another empire that threatens them, Rome. They're the world's leading superpower. So the Jewish people, they're this minority group, and death and violence are coming for them if they act out of line. And their situation isn't all that different from Isaiah's time, 700 years prior. And they may not be in physical exile, but they're in a spiritual exile. And I would imagine God with us seemed like this far-fetched idea in their mind. Maybe they hear that prophecy in Isaiah 7 and they look around them and they're like, what are we talking about? God's not with us. Feels like God has given up on us. God doesn't care about us or what's happening around us. I mean, look at everything. He's forgotten about us. He's quiet. He's silent. And so Matthew wants his audience to connect the dots here when he drops this line in Isaiah, from Isaiah 7 into Matthew chapter 1. He wants them to connect the dots to see that the people still find themselves once again asking what Ahaz was asking. God, what do we do? God, where are you in all this? God, how do we know you will protect us? God, where are you? And the answer to that is Jesus, Emmanuel. When all seems lost, Emmanuel. When uncertainty, doubt, and pain come creeping in, Emmanuel. When the anger and the grief and the darkness and the hopelessness feel like they want to get the final word, Emmanuel, God with us. So wait for him even when things feel hopeless, because God is on the move. You see, Advent is for those who are waiting and longing. If you feel hopeless, if you feel stuck, if you feel frustrated by life, Advent invites you in to the Jesus story. So for them, it was waiting on God to remind themselves God is with them, even in the midst of war, even in the midst of poverty and famine and bloodshed. God was with them. And if God can be with them in something as big as that, then he can help you in the small and with everything in between. And that's an important note because if we're honest, Christmas can tend to have a lot of expectations of what it's supposed to feel like, of what it's supposed to be. It's like as soon as Thanksgiving is over, we sort of have all of these preloaded assumptions and expectations of what this season ought to feel like. It's supposed to be the most wonderful time of year, the special season where where our problems get put to the side and everything is as it should be. The family's together, our problems feel like miles away. We strive to be happier, more joyous, and sometimes it is that. But if we're not careful, we can forget to acknowledge the reality that sometimes it's just not. The reality tends to be something less than the expectation. Perhaps Christmas for you is marked by awkward conversations with family members that you don't know that well, or maybe not even like that well. Or maybe for you, Christmas can simply mean stress and anxiety, and you wonder, God, where are you? God, how am I supposed to see you in all of this? Maybe it goes deeper than that. Maybe Christmas isn't all we wished it to be because life isn't what we wish it to be either. Maybe the holiday season for you is accompanied by sadness and pain. Maybe it brings up feelings of loneliness for you. Maybe this is the year where there's an empty seat at the table that didn't used to be there. A voice missing from all the excitement of decorating the tree and sharing meals and opening gifts. And so for the Advent season, there's just this acute sense of loss and pain that you are feeling right now. The reality for many of us, despite what the songs on the radio say, Christmas can be more of a reminder that life hasn't turned out how you hoped it would be more than anything else. It's far more monotonous or lonely or painful. And there's a lot more sin and struggle than you thought would be there. You had perhaps this pictured reality of like, just a few years from now, I'm going to be like this. And then you look at your life and what you're struggling with, and then you're just left feeling disappointed in this season. And you're asking, God, where are you? Where are you in the midst of this? And just like the Israelites in their spiritual exile, they were awaiting the first advent. We are also 2,000 years later waiting on the second advent, still living in a world broken by sin and filled with pain and loss and frustration. And for some, what can feel like silence from God, perhaps wondering, God, where are you? God, what are you doing? Are you even there? And if that is you, again, Advent welcomes you and invites you in to the story of Jesus. As theologian and pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said, he said, the celebration of Advent is possible only to those who are troubled in soul, who know themselves to be poor and imperfect, and who look forward to something greater to come. In other words, if you feel troubled in your soul, Advent is for you. If you feel poor in spirit, Advent is for you. If you feel imperfect or lost or alone or stuck in your guilt or your shame, Advent is for you. And the good news of Advent is not just that God came to us, but rather the good news of Advent is that God is with us. That's what it means, Emmanuel, God with us. That is the answer to all of our questions. When everything feels dark and despair and depression come creeping in, and we're asking, God, where are you in the midst of this? God, how can I hope in you? God, I need you right now. How do I know you will keep your word? God, where are you? God answers back and says, Emmanuel, I'm with you. I'm here with you right now. I'm in it, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm in this for the long haul with you in your darkness and in your pain and in your loneliness and in your despair, and I'm not going anywhere. That is the answer. In fact, this is what sets Christianity apart from everything else. We worship a God who became like us, who incarnated, who took on flesh and all the pain and hardship that comes along with becoming human. He became like us to save us. He isn't just with us in some spiritual or metaphorical sense, but he physically embodied flesh and overcame death and sin And as the author of Hebrews writes, we can draw near to God with all the confidence, with all of our struggle and pain and longing for hope in this season and in every other season of life, because he is a God who knows, who stepped into our pain, who stepped into our heartbreak and our loneliness, because he is a God who cares, and he is a God who is there, and he is a God who is present with us with whatever we are going through. I think about how in my life, just over the years, when sadness and heartbreak and news comes that we just didn't expect, and it just seems like the bottom has just dropped out of life and we just don't know what to do, whether that was a miscarriage we experienced or an adoption falling apart or getting a call from a loved one about a terminal diagnosis. And fast forward, and we're at funeral of a loved one. And in all of those instances, and I could list off more, but in all of those instances, I remember the people who were present with me in that, who came over, who showed up with a bag of gifts just to show us some love and care, who gave us hugs, who just wanted to sit down with us and just let us vent for a while about how frustrated and unfair it all felt. I remember the people who were with me, who let me just be transparent and cry and voice frustration in all of it. I remember the people who were present with me in the pain. And in those moments, like, I didn't need a Bible verse per se. I didn't need some like Christian spiritual platitude. I just needed someone who was present with me to enter into my pain. That meant all the world to me. I'll never forget who was with me in my pain. And believer, this is what God says to you. This is the beauty of the Advent season, that in your pain, in your anxiety, in your loneliness, God enters into the pain with you. And he says, I am with you. I'm here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. So if you're experiencing anxiety, maybe you're worried over a financial strain, or maybe you're just in the hustle and bustle of it all, figuring out like, how am I going to get all of this done this season? Or you're worried that life is going to fall apart, God says, fear not, I am with you. If you're feeling the loss of a relationship and you feel the loneliness trying to creep in, God kneels down to you and says, I am with you. I'm here with you. If you're feeling depression and darkness set in and nothing seems to give you hope or joy, God draws closer to you and steps into your darkness and says, I am with you. I'm here with you forever. Emmanuel is God with us. And this is what Isaiah and Matthew are trying to tell us about the Messiah, about Jesus, that God is a God who knows, he's a God who cares, and he is a God who stays by our side no matter what. And the Christmas story is the tangible expression of God kneeling down and saying, I got you. And as long as there's breath in my lungs, I will take care of you. And I'm going to help you get through life because I am with you. In fact, Jesus promises this to his people before he ascends to heaven at the end of Matthew. He says, I will be with you always until the very end of the age, forever. And now for those who believe in Jesus and follow Jesus through his Holy Spirit, his presence dwells in us and with us, always by your side, always near you in your pain, ever present and never leaving. So I don't know how this season is for you, whether it's the most wonderful time of the year, like a magical Disney movie, like that's your life. If so, that's awesome. Or if this is the worst time of year, or somewhere in between that. Regardless, this is the God we worship at Christmas for the rest of our lives. This is the God who arrived in a manger some 2,000 years ago, and the God who will arrive again. So whatever you're feeling this Advent, you can bring that all before God the Father with confidence. He invites us into his story, to live into his story, to give us this hope.